9:31, we are going to start our policy committee meeting for October 25th, 2023. And I just want to start by welcoming our CAC member who is officially joining our policy committee meeting as a non-voting member, but contributing to the conversation. Celeste McNeish.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Glad to have you here.
We're very excited. I'm excited to be here.
Okay. 1.02, approval of our September 27th policy committee meeting minutes. Motion?
Motion for approval. Second.
Okay. Any questions, comments, concerns? Okay. All those in favor of approval? All three of us? Okay. Wonderful. 1.03, public comment. Do we have any public comment?
I was wondering if Jillian was.
No public comment, and we do not have any written public comment that was submitted or to the agenda. So we will move right along to 1.04, policy 101, organization of the board.
Thank you. So policy 101, during our August 30th meeting, Mr. Bass asked that this be put on the agenda for information and discussion, and my fault, I inadvertently left it off of our committee meeting from September. So I apologize, Mr. Bass, for that oversight. But per that request, it has been put on the policy committee's agenda for today for information and discussion to understand what it is, Mr. Bass and Mr. Rose and Ms. Gallagher, what your interests are in looking at this policy.
Sure. I have two smaller points and then the ideas that I have on a candidate forum. I guess I'll start with candidate forum. When at the, let's see, 1.101.2, electing officers, it's a very, we have two sentences in the policy on how we elect officers, and I think the nature of it is that it doesn't allow for discussion or asking questions of those board members who want to run for a leadership role. And I think we would benefit from hearing candidates' interest in why they would want to serve as president or vice president of the board, and having board members be able to ask questions. This morning, I emailed some potential language that we could use. I think I'll read it out loud for point of discussion and see what folks think. But some potential language could be, at its first meeting in December, the board shall hold a candidate forum. The candidate forum shall take place after the swearing in of any newly elected board members and before officer elections. Any member of the board interested in running for an officer position, president or vice president, shall inform the board executive assistant by email prior to the forum or self-nominate at the forum. Candidates for leadership will have an opportunity to present a brief statement of purpose, no more than 5 minutes. We'll take questions from their colleagues for up to 45 minutes total. Candidates will then have the opportunity to present a brief closing statement, up to 3 minutes. The session will take place in an open meeting. It will be facilitated by the board ombuds. I think that this presents a limited amount of time, about an hour, where folks can speak, we can ask questions. Yeah, we can hear different perspectives for those who want to serve as president or vice president.
I'm certainly open to, because I think the language in 101.2 is rather broad. So if there's any procedure really outlined there in that 2 sentence, we could probably do anything we wanted.
As long as you have
I mean, I
elections.
think typically it would be held as part of an admin function,
Yeah,
process.
typically
Yeah,
admin
to
function.
decide how we want to actually
Mhm.
conduct the election
Within
process.
the-
Yes.
guidelines of those two sentences.
Right.
So I would support, I guess I would support language that outlines the specifics around that procedure. I don't know that I would support some of the minutes, the amount of time spent on it. I guess I have to ask more questions. Are you talking about 45 minutes total for the whole process or 45 minutes per?
45 minutes total for questions of the candidates. And
All
so-
candidates.
So say there were, I don't know, if there were two candidates, it's complicated because, right, then there's also vice president but let's say we have two candidates. Let's say we have three candidates for a total of two positions, right? 15 minutes, up to 15 minutes would be opening statements, 45 minutes for questioning, and then up to 9 minutes, right? For the closing would still be about an hour.
Mr. Best, might I offer you a thought if you guys are looking for something between the two?
Sure.
In some organizations, what they will do is they will establish a group of sort of nominating committee questions. I'm not saying we need a nominating committee, but that actually the opportunity to answer the questions is outside of the voting process. So if you are interested in being the board president, there'd be, let's say, I'm making this up, 3 questions that you'd be asked to speak to, and you would write your answers, and those would be sort of loaded into board docs that anyone could read, which doesn't, just to avoid the idea of sort of, some people perform better on the spot than others, right? In terms of being asked questions that they don't have time to maybe think on their feet. And so there might be an opportunity to establish maybe 3 questions that, you know, what is your interest in being an elected member of the board leadership? What is your, I'm making these up. What's your engagement style in terms of facilitating collaboration with your colleagues or whatever it might be? They could answer those in writing. It may be a way of, instead of having an open meeting discussion and interview process, to also get some of the information you're at. Just wanted to offer that as an alternative.
I mean, that would certainly be an improvement from what we have now. The 2 challenges with that would be, it wouldn't allow not self-nominations from the floor. And I do think there could be a scenario where someone does want to self-nominate. And the other thing is the skill of being able to handle questions spur of the moment, I think is a skill we do need in our board leadership. I think it's part of how things end up functioning.
So, I mean, for me, I appreciate this idea because there is no established process or procedure that allows for an open dialogue and a transparent process for elected leadership. I do wonder if there are other LEAs that have some established processes that we could look at before we come back to the board.
And that's what I was going to actually offer, Ms. Gallagher, is why don't I take this language back, because this is just information discussion. There's no action being taken. We'll come back. We'll do so. I'll have my team do some research on what other LEAs do and what other organizations of similar structure do, and see what different. We'll come up with some maybe options for you with different language for each option, and then you can decide which you think works best for the policy committee to recommend to the board.
There may be some combination of like 1 or 2 standard questions that we want candidates to respond to. I really appreciate the 2 that you just pulled out of the hat on the spur of the moment.
Running for board president now.
And then maybe there is an opportunity for board members to ask a question or 2, because I think you're right, a lot of what leadership has to juggle in the middle are things that come up, that might not be anticipated.
I suppose a challenge.
No, I was just going to say, I guess if we went that route, we're going to have to move the nomination
Correct.
to the previous meeting.
you'd have to create some distance
Yeah, you'd have to
between
create some
nominations and elections.
In elections.
The challenge with that is if a newly elected member of the board wanted to run for leadership, I don't think they would be installed yet. And certainly, I don't think we probably don't have the right, I don't think it would be wise or have the right to say that someone who's been elected cannot then run, right? Like there's no process where we would say, oh, you need a year of experience before you run for president or vice
Although there
president.
may be some wisdom in that. So that's sort of an interesting
Perhaps.
question that we should probably benchmark with other districts, right? Like, would, I don't know.
I think it would be up to the wisdom of all of us. I would not want to see that in the policy. I guess my concern is timing. Perhaps, I suppose this is tight timing to start with, but certainly it does not seem like there's a scenario where if we're going back to get language from other LEAs, that we could have this in place in any way for this December.
However, like Mr. Blivis mentioned, admin function could be utilized for us as a board to discuss a
Right.
process for the elections for this year.
Within the current
Within the
language
current
of
language,
Yes,
101.2.
because there is nothing that would prevent us from doing something differently for this year, but that would have to be a discussion
And
outside of the policy committee, which I think we could certainly do.
Right.
yeah, I mean, realistically, even if we had brought this to the last policy committee meeting and had language for you today, it is unlikely it would have been through the 2 readings before the board that it would need before the December meeting were to occur.
But
So-
it really is, I don't know, I guess in some way, it is encouraging to think about the ways that we can structure this within our current language.
Mhm.
I don't know, for me,
Yeah.
that's encouraging.
I hear you sharing 2 interests. I hear you sharing an interest around a more robust process, right? That has some degree of interview or evaluation of the candidate. And I also hear you having an interest in the transparency of that, of where that happens, right? So I think the good news is among those 2 interests, the transparency and the robustness, you already have the latitude and admin function to create a more robust process. So you're going to get one of those 2 interests. Those are within your current ability to achieve. The transparency, the public facing, the open session part of that will probably have to come. But I do think you have some latitude to design put more rigor, if you will, into your current structure in admin.
Yeah,
And you had some other,
I do.
I do too, so, but please continue.
Okay. Two smaller points. There's discussion of advisory committees, and I think that's actually one of the best. I'm encouraged by reading this in the policy, but also I am reminded that so I guess I'm looking more at 101.4, board member assignments, advisory committees. Just whether there are if there are additional advisory committees, whether there should be language around how that's determined, or ad hoc committees. Just, I think we have functioned relatively well in the last few years in creating ad hoc committees as needed. I think in my first year on the board, I served on kind of a work group for looking at issues around Sibyllsville, and I served with 2 other board members on that. But it's not totally clear to me where in this policy we create for the president of the board that opportunity to do that.
So, and the last sentence of 101.3 is the board may establish ad hoc committees as needed to address a specific issue or concern. And so that is a power reserved to the board. It's not specific to the board president. So presumably it would have to go through the normal process of someone would ask that it would have to come on the agenda as a need with the 3 board member, support, and then the normal discussion, a motion to create, a vote, and then the process for selecting members. It would be, the normal process we use for any other board action.
I think that is the robust process that I support. I don't know that we've always followed that robust a process, and so I just think spelling that out maybe in a separate bullet point called ad hoc committees, I think would help all of us.
Makes sense.
We can certainly prepare language that addresses that, if that's the interest of all of the panel. I mean, I don't do this based on one, right? I do this.
Bump everything else down, have 1.01.
Well, we're gonna have to reformat the whole.
It's all gonna be
thing.
reformatted anyway, so.
Yeah, so just add a separate,
About how the
Bullet
actual
about
process,
how
right?
ad hoc
Establishing the
committees are
need, getting a second, getting a motion.
yes, perfect, thank you.
For me, the last one was on the student member, and this is, this change would be conditional on if the student member were to get additional voting rights. But I'll say that my view is if the student member were to get, say, full voting rights, I would advocate that we change this to any student currently enrolled as a junior in FCPS who meets the criteria. I think the extra responsibility in, say, full voting rights would cause me to want it to end up being a high school senior serving in that role with those additional responsibilities. I mean, as it is now, even with no formal voting rights, we do not allow we do not allow freshmen to run. You have to be a sophomore or junior. And so I would advocate that only a junior could run, for senior year if we do more full voting rights.
That would eliminate Ms. Lieberman.
That's what I was gonna say, that would exclude the opportunity of our incoming student member of the board for having the opportunity to run for state student member of the board.
Correct.
I'm not sure that I would support excluding them from that opportunity.
Yeah, the state student member, I was just looking up, has to be a junior or senior.
But I mean, if the whole point is they run here,
Correct,
run
they
as
do.
a sophomore,
Correct.
serve as a junior, and then are able to run for state board.
Yes.
Dr. Sergo, and I didn't see this, you're seeing that on the state
The
level,
Maryland Association of Student Councils
you have to be a junior or a senior.
for that.
Right. And so along those lines, the board years ago decided, even though a junior could serve at the state level, that they were not going to allow a freshman to serve here their sophomore year and run for state board junior year. That distinction has already been made. And so I do advocate that we make that distinction further. If all conditional on if we were to do any further voting rights for the student.
And it is that condition that I would say is the reason to just put a pin in this until that condition would be met. I mean, we as a policy committee, or you as a policy committee, we're able to act relatively quickly. And this would not be difficult language to create or to change. So we could get it through policy committee and through the 2 sessions of the board relatively quickly, I think. But it also may depend on whether, what's the source of that change in the voting rights? Is it a decision made by the board itself, or is it a result of legislation that prescribes to us, here's what they are able to vote on, and here's, the General Assembly could tell us exactly what it is they want for that. I would suggest we wait until that change is made, and then we circle back to figure out how we want to apply it.
So I also had this highlighted as a discussion point today, not the grades, but the voting rights of the student member, because that is part of this particular policy. We've had some discussion at the board level, and so a change to this could also be spurred by a discussion here about voting rights for student members, right? I mean, this is a part of the policy, and the policy committee is talking about this particular policy. Although certainly we couldn't make a decision about that, but if the policy committee wanted to elevate this discussion to the full board.
Right.
I guess that's my question, is that it seems that some LEAs put this forward to their delegation and have it put forward as legislation, while others just
Well,
make
the
it a
height-
policy.
I'm not the legal expert, but I know that a lot of this came out last year because two parents sued in Howard County because the student member of the board vote, they had voting rights, was what prevented them from reopening schools. And what the courts had found in that case was that the student, that didn't violate anything. But the argument was that they were not of voting age, right? This sort of, it was like, so that was the logic. But in Howard County, it's a junior or senior as well. I mean, we could certainly pull together a list of by county what their grades are, but.
Well, and we have the excellent research that was done last spring by Mr. Tessarello, if I remember right, on the voting rights, and we know from that presentation that, you know, the LEAs largely have a lot of leeway to do what they want with respect to the voting rights. And some they have full voting rights, and some they have voting rights on everything except budget and personnel related items. I mean, there's a lot of flexibility if that's something that you're interested in doing. You know, you three can indicate to us what you're looking for. We'll write it up, and then it'll get submitted to the board for review.
I think if you could kind of refresh us on Mr. Tessarello's presentation, what information he was able to provide for that, and maybe supplement it with your own research as far as what other LEAs are doing, how they went about it. Because like I said, I know some went formally to the legislature and had it codified in legislation, while others have just changed their policy.
Right, and
So
I think Mr. Bass's point is one that we always want to be mindful of, because the question is, to what extent do you want a minor to make decisions that could have sweeping impact across the entire system? And so that's, I think, to Mr. Blevis's point, which is you may want to boundary the voting rights in some way. Do you want them to be the determining vote on whether or not someone is terminated, or whether or not we take employment action, or whether or not we pass the budget? I mean, I think there are questions that I think you're raising in that, which is what's the threshold for being able to really understand the magnitude of that vote and the potential impacts, particularly on a board. Now, in some districts, they then they're the eighth, right? So that's when you run into this issue of
That
would be the case here, right? So then you run into issues of split voting and things like, so it's just, you have to think like beyond the moment of the vote and the symbolism of that and sort of the unintended consequences. So we'll pull some stuff together.
And you can anticipate for those kinds of challenges. I mean, Robert's Rules addresses how to deal when you have a even number board, yes, even number size board, and what the vote requirements are in that circumstance.
Yeah. It's good. It's a great topic, though. The whole purpose of them being here is about civics, and that's sort of one of our fundamental things that we teach. So how do we have them be more than a symbolic number, but also not create unintended consequences from their participation?
Agreed.
And protect them from that. I would just say this, I'd be remiss, having been in another district with a student member who had voting rights to some extent, they were subject to tremendous trolling on the internet and harassment by adults. And I do think we have a responsibility collectively to insulate our students from the nature of elected office and having that kind of power. And I would say that having watched that, that troubled all of us deeply. And I do think that's another thing to be mindful of.
The trade-off in that circumstance for having the right to vote meant getting about 1,000 emails,
Correct.
all that say the exact same thing because it's a form email, just flooding your inbox. And
so
that can
you're
be, that's,
incompetent and you shouldn't be a vote.
Yeah.
You shouldn't. And, it was
and
really
that's
fun.
overwhelming for adults, let alone for a student.
Well, I mean, I agree. I would like to see some sort of comparison of Maryland LEAs. I know Anne Arundel County student member is the only student member in the entire country that has full voting rights on everything, including personnel and budget. That came up at the NABE conference a few weeks ago, and then we heard, I think, from a lot of different student members about it.
Yeah, I think that entire panel at least had some
Voting rights.
voting
Some
rights.
that, like Carroll County, that have not they're the student representative. So I would like to see
Somewhere
sort of
between
a
the two.
breakdown of
Yes.
what that looks like for us to consider, and then maybe we can bring it back to the board. Yep.
Okay.
Did you have anything else? No. Okay. I just had a couple. I mean, clearly, when we go back to making revisions to this. There's some outdated information in the advisory committee definition. In particular, we made some updates to policy committee. Obviously has some updated language that needs to be in there, as well as like advisory. There's a sentence in there about recommendations going to the curriculum specialist. We just made some decisions at a recent board meeting about some process around that.
Yeah.
There's also, so within this, I think there's been a general practice that the board president doesn't serve on policy and curriculum instruction, but that's not codified in here at all. There's no language about the role of the board president and advisory committees. I don't know if that's just kind of practice that, or if it's been.
So is that, I mean, so which way do you think which way would you want that to go? Would you want the language to be that they are not to serve on those, or that they, may serve on those? Because it is silent now, I mean, it leaves it open, and the practice has been for them to not, but that doesn't mean they couldn't. It would be up to the members of the board when you're making the decisions on who's on which committee.
Yeah. Personally, and just being brand new to this, I kind of like the fact that the president is not part of particularly those two required committees, because they then have some distance and are able to kind of, oversee and work with both of those committees and what's coming about. So I kind of like that. I would be for maybe we should actually speak it out here.
But they're not on those two
But they're
committees.
not on those.
They can serve on
That's
others.
just me personally. They serve, they already serve on other, as liaisons on other committees. So I kind of like that it creates a little distance from the board president.
For me, I think the practice has been good, but I'm encouraged by what you're saying about the silence of it allows for either. It's hard for me to identify a reason I would want to see the president of the board serving on policy or CNI, but I actually think I do want that to remain an opportunity. Again, hard for me to identify why, but I'm not sure that I would want to codify that they're forbidden to.
I don't know, but one thing I just being new to this though, is because in the language, the board president does the assignments. So for me, for transparency's sake, it allows, if we didn't, it allows the president to go, boy, looking at the review schedule for the upcoming year, I kind of like to be on policy. And assign themselves to policy or assign themselves to curriculum instruction. So just throw that out there.
Said or not.
Or not. But that's one reason I kind of like the distance from it, is that they don't get to choose, because then that would make them a fourth member on each of those committees.
Yeah, so, and 4 makes it difficult for both.
Oh, interesting. I assumed that if they were to put themselves up, they would have to be one of 3.
Then what would you do with that? That would bump somebody not getting to serve on curriculum instruction.
Yeah.
And I guess for me, we have a lot of things that are done in practice, but they're not formalized or structured. And I don't particularly like that approach, because then it sort of just depends on who's sitting in the seat at the time and it.
Right.
So I prefer things to be spelled out if that's the way things are going to be done. But I do appreciate the opportunity for some flexibility.
So let me counterpoint my own point. I mean, because the flexibility is there,
You
but
just argue among yourself.
yeah, well, and I do that. Trust me, I do that all the time. No, but if you think about the policy committee and the curriculum instruction committee, those are the 2 core functions that the board serves, right? Is to create the policy that guides the system and to set the curriculum that we give to the students. The board president, as the board president, also has a really large, heavy load function. And there's justifiable reason to not want the person who is carrying that heavy load of having to do the agenda setting, having all of those other meetings that that the regular committee members just don't have, or regular board members just don't have to attend, not also have to be involved in those heavy hitter, advisory committees, because it is it's protecting the president's time and the president's ability to do their job by not making them available for those other committees. That would be my own counterpoint to the flexibility.
I agree. I guess I think that if we wanted to spell out the language, I would support that. I think we should also consider, do we want any language in here around committee assignments are discussed in a board admin function. I think that could be unwieldy in some ways, but currently there is such an opaqueness to how board members are assigned.
You all have an opportunity to indicate your interest.
Yes, but it's not always followed.
Yeah,
I feel like it's not necessarily relevant to specific experiences. I think the best thing for me to say is there is an opaqueness around, you put in your preferences and then the board president, or I want to give Ms. Johnson some credit. I believe that she empowered Mr. Rose as vice president in this case, which I think democratized the process a little bit. But my personal preference is that board committees be discussed in a admin function with final authority given to the board president for assignment.
So if we're going to draft some language, which certainly can do, if we're going to draft some language around this, how into the weeds in the details do you want to go? So, do you want this to be down to the level of no member of one committee will serve on that same committee in more than 2 consecutive years? Or, do we want to get to that level of detail?
But maybe a little more specificity.
So we'll come back with some language around the process of preferences and the process of.
Mr. Bass's suggestion where we just had a board discussion in admin function instead of phone calls or emails back and forth saying, where would you like to serve? Well, they'd like to serve there and you'd like to serve, maybe we just have a discussion as a board in admin function and everybody says, well, I've served on CTAC for the last 2 years. I'd like to move on to something else, or I'd like to stay and see through some policies that will, something like that. So I think it's worth having an open discussion, and then, like Mr. Bass said, leaving the final to board leadership. So, ultimately the final decision rests with board leadership, because if 2 people both want this, you ultimately have to make a decision. So,
would you be interested in the decisions being finalized from not just the board president, but a 3-person committee of the board president, the board vice president, and the superintendent?
The superintendent wouldn't necessarily have oversight over policy.
I don't think that's, I think I'd just say board leader, final rest with board leadership.
This would be such a step in the right direction on transparency, but ultimately the person elected board president does need to have authority to make some final decisions.
Yep, I agree with that.
We will put together some language.
Okay, thank you.
So you're gonna come back whenever.
Next whenever.
I believe November 20th is our next one.
Is that realistic to have some updates and recommendations?
Yes.
I will be cautiously optimistic.
As well as the student member discussion and some recommendations.
Because then we do November 20th, and then that's it.
That's a
till
Monday.
January, right?
No, we have
No.
a December meeting.
We have a virtual December session.
Okay.
We scheduled. That
Yes.
was an addition.
That was an
I wanted to
addition, yes.
confirm that. Good, okay.
And that's virtual, you said?
That's a virtual session, yes. And we will put out the link as we normally would with the agenda. Yes.
It is.
It's on,
Yeah,
at 11.
That's why it's the
It's at
11th.
11. It's later in the morning.
Yeah, but on the 13th.
Yes.
Got it.
All right.
Sure.
That was a very robust discussion. Thank you. shall we move on to 1.05?
I think so.
200, which I imagine will also be a
Robust discussion. Yeah. So policy 200 is the school attendance areas and redistricting. This was originally brought to the policy committee for information discussion on August 30th. And it took us took us a little while, but we got some changes to present. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Lebo and not a doctor, are you? Okay, not a doctor. I'm trying to elevate him, but not a doctor yet. Mr. Mamoon.
So good morning. Appreciate the opportunity to be back here with you. And so sort of would like to just walk you through where our thoughts were and hoping we captured the board's comments from our last discussion and the action items that we had. So using the red line version, if that's okay, the first sort of three paragraphs, policy purpose, definition, and policy statement, really just try to clean that up to align with the new standard that we're having. I don't think there was anything significant. Obviously, we changed the wording and realigned it, but again, that was to be more consistent with the other policies that the board has recently approved. So I didn't know in particular if there were concerns that we should address or look at further in the policy statement. And then as we jumped into implementation, the first one in the first paragraph was just a consistency. We scratched of schools because we just referred to the superintendent as the superintendent elsewhere on the document. So that was the recommendation there. And then,
Or if we have questions that we.
or
like to advise, I don't.
however you like, sorry.
I have two comments and questions.
Sure.
Yeah, no, I'll prefer it that way.
So my first question was around, so the second sentence, with the exception of some special programs, students are expected to attend the school assigned based on their residence. My question was just around whether or not it would make sense to be more specific about what some special programs fall under that, or if that would be too, I mean, again, I think this sort of goes back to our previous discussion about transparency and also having some flexibility so that we don't have to come back and revise a policy every time we make a small tweak. But some special programs sounds pretty broad to me, and so I don't know if there are, if we do have a definition of which special programs in particular we would consider.
We can certainly add language. I think some of that was just to your point on allowed some flexibility and consistent with the previous version. I mean, really what they're speaking of there are specialized programs for our students receiving special education services, as well at the high school level, some of the signature programs like IB or the Academy of Fine Arts or ROTC, where they wouldn't go to their primary, but it doesn't require an out-of-district to attend those programs. It's a separate application process.
And I guess part of my question here too was, currently district, we have links at Frederick High and nowhere else. But I noticed that wasn't one of the programs that you listed, but would it be considered under that caveat? My assumption was the special programs were more directed at like special education programs in particular, approaching the other programs that you already mentioned are already part of our consideration, but not.
And I want to defer a little bit to our high school director on that process a little bit, because we do have high school programs, specialized programs at every high school of some sort. I think we refer to them as our signature programs, but not all of them are open county-wide to attend for that reason. So Links is an example where AFA is the opposite, where it is open to all students throughout the district. Certainly, I'm not opposed to that.
So what I would suggest is we create a definition for specialized programs for the purposes of the policy and for the purposes of this policy only, what we would define that to be. And then we can work with the director, and SASA and everyone, it'll run through cabinet most likely to make sure we've captured all of the programs that we want to identify as part of that specialized program.
Because I think there's, as Dr. Lebo pointed out, there's a difference between open school programs and closed program. So I just think we need to make sure we define that.
Yeah.
Because this is very, in my opinion, this would have parents saying, well, I want in on that program that they had access to, even though it's a closed program to that school.
Oh.
See what I'm saying?
If they're not in the program, but it's in their school location.
And now they're getting moved out,
And they want to be
they
back
want to
in.
stay in it, but
They
it's
wanna
not
get in
an
the
open
program.
program.
Which particular item do you think leaves that?
Well, I think it just says, with the exception of
I'm sorry.
some special
It's
programs,
D1.
under attendance areas, D1.
Oh, D1A, thank you, I couldn't find it.
It just says with the exception of some special programs, and there's no definition of
Oh,
what
right,
special
right.
programs are, and that would
Yeah.
lead me to believe that it could,
Yeah.
my program could be. this-
The question is, was that intended to mean specialized programs or programs of distinction, right? Because in most cases in here, it says special education, it means specialized programs, so. okay.
Because I lead that to believe IB and, all the other people.
I guess I would prefer it to be more.
Yeah.
In some way, so that we
And that's why adding a definition, which we can, which we can craft, and the challenge in crafting the definition will be to capture what we need to capture, while at the same time remaining flexible, so we don't have to come back every time we add a new program or we remove a program that we would have to come back and change this policy over and over again. But we'll figure that out.
Thank you.
I have one other question in that same paragraph. And it's, I guess it's the next sentence. So it mentions, if the superintendent determines that the number of out-of-district students attending childcare centers is a significant factor in causing enrollment pressures. Can you, what is the significance of the childcare centers in particular in this? in the attendance area?
Let me just.
Go ahead.
So one of the circumstances that would get you eligibility for an out-of-district transfer could be childcare. And so if you have a number of childcare, people have gotten transfer requests because of their childcare, those can tip the school over their enrollment. And so sometimes that can happen. And sometimes people, we're not just talking about childcare centers, it could be an in-home, it could be any sort of childcare circumstance. And so you could have a lot of people, and 99% of people are honest and transparent about their needs, but there are times that this can be abused, candidly, to gain access to a program, because we don't go around and verify, we don't go sit in our cars and watch, are you really in a childcare there? But you can say that you're getting childcare, most people are, but it can push a school over their enrollment capacity.
So
They're saying this is my before and after cares in the Oakdale district.
Here, right.
I need to go to Oakdale,
I see.
yeah. And now you've got 300 kids who are not boundary to Oakdale, but are attending there because their before and after care is in that theater.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a hyperbole and a made up story, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to be clear.
That is a tough one, because I'm
Yeah.
aware of childcare facilities
Right.
that actually run buses.
So it could be
on
my
behalf of their
mother
clients, but
lives
they
in the.
only run it to the closest.
Right, and legitimately, you may have someone
Yeah.
helping you with before and after care as a working parent who is, and it's for safety, and you need your kid to be able to go to the school that's nearest the person watching your child.
Mhm.
But it can put a pressure point on your school, on that particular
I mean, I can
school.
speak to that because we considered it. My children, this is a long time ago, my children went to daycare in the Spring Ridge
Right.
Elementary area,
Exactly.
actually right across the street, but
Right.
we lived in the Urbana.
Did they get an out of district to Spring Ridge?
We decided not to do it, so, but
But
I'm
you
just
could
saying,
have
we could
applied
have,
and.
we
right,
could have.
exactly.
And that's a,
Many of the providers, especially the large care, childcare centers, if they are near multiple attendance boundaries, do provide buses. We provide bus service if you are in district and the childcare center is within that attendance area. So, if you're sort of split between, the North Frederick and the Parkway attendance areas, a childcare center in that area, sometimes we'll offer a bus service to again, it's a business model for them where we wouldn't provide bus service if we said it's in the North Frederick attendance area for folks who go to Parkway.
Right.
But the childcare center would say, we'll provide that bus service. So that's not uncommon throughout
Okay.
the district.
Good. Well, it's good to know that we collaborate.
Thank you.
Other questions on sorry, the attendance areas piece?
Now we can move to the sections that are really red.
Yes. So on the redistricting process, we hope, staff hopes that we captured all the policy committee's intent with these, in particular, the list of factors that were identified, really try to put quantifiable elements in there that we heard the board say, or the policy committee rather, were important for your consideration and for staff to evaluate as we look at redistricting options. A couple of areas that I wanted to highlight that weren't necessarily, it was you asked staff to go back and evaluate a little bit, and part of that was the target capacity utilization range. Felt like that was important for us to have something at the staff level. We talked earlier about trying to understand the board's intent, but if we don't put it in black and white, it's sort of hard in the future. We had this discussion around previous redistricting studies. Well, we thought that was the board's intent, but it was never codified in black and white. And so we're trying to, what would that really look like? And we know we'll have fluctuations throughout Frederick County as houses turnover, or we have some growth. And so thought that that was an appropriate utilization range to put. That we found some other documentation from other districts. Others put it in the 90 to 110% range. Our perspective was, if we're not at 100%, is that really worth having the redistricting discussion at that point, given that we can operate at 100% capacity, and so why would we want to preemptively have that discussion? So that was the rationale for that utilization rate. Again, none of this is binding. It's really about when that conversation starts for staff and the board.
Okay. No, I appreciate that.
I feel like this really captured what we, the whole sections.
So we can move on the process. So similarly, Align tried to take out some of the ambiguity in some of the language, and also a recognition of, put a statement in there because we've talked about this publicly. No two redistricting studies are identical. So whether it's a smaller scale redistricting or it's 2/3 of the county at some point, we want to make sure that the policy addresses the scalability of that need and is not overly prescriptive. However, what we tried to do, and think we did, was to say staff will never move forward without approval from the board. And so we will bring the scope and we will bring the plan forward within these parameters assigned, and the board will approve this. One consideration that we talked about the last time and hope we captured the intent was the singular option. I think if we used this redistricting, I can speak to, this is now the 4th that I have done in this role. We really got some robust feedback because it was concentrated and it wasn't this widespread, if I can use the Oakdale and the Butterfly Ridge ones previously when we had multiple options that went out. It really became a vote, like, oh, no, I really like A, or I really like B, which didn't help staff get to a better product for the board to evaluate. And so this singular option that says, this is a discussion starting point. What do you like? What should we modify? What haven't we considered? I think we got really good feedback. And I think what you saw in the 3 alternatives in the Crestwood area was really solely based on feedback that we got from the community, but it allowed it to be focused. As opposed to what appeared to be sort of a vote, because, and we've talked about this, frankly, that vote is not helpful for staff to be able to give the board and the public a better product.
And maybe it's just also around the use of language for when we have that one that we're sort of, rather than saying superintendent recommended, or whatever, however it was presented, I think that for the community to respond to that, it felt more like, this is what we're doing.
Agreed.
But it did result in a lot of really helpful feedback that we've received, that you all have received. So now we have 4 options. But I think just maybe the language, which doesn't, to me, need to be in the policy. It's thinking about how it's presented to the community moving forward, so that there's not that reaction, like this is it and it's not going to change because this is the implementation.
Agreed.
So I appreciate what you've laid out here as well.
One small question on process. In J, you've gotten rid of 5th grade as a potential exemption to redistricting, added 11th grade. What was the decision around taking out 5th grade?
And if my notes were incorrect, I thought that was part of the discussion of, do we want to focus on secondary schools versus 5th grade? We can certainly add that back in. I had that as a note, that we wanted to talk more 11th, 12th, and then 8th graders.
I can't remember. It's more likely than not, your notes are accurate. And yet at this point, I'll say, I think it would be really, really challenging for a 5th grader to have had, 5-6 years in elementary school and then for 1 year have to go to a different elementary school. I think the 5th grade should stay in there.
So my notes from August 30th on this point are, do we strike altogether the grandfathering, because there was some talk about that term, and as you can see, that's been taken out,
Right.
and replace with waiver status to students based on space availability, prioritization of 5th, 8th, and 12th. Those are my notes.
So we did talk about keeping, or
5th, 8th, and 12th, and not 11th.
Yeah, 11th was not, no, I mean, my notes are not the end all, they are not the meeting minutes, they're just my notes.
Well, you're the only one who has them.
I
We'll
will
go
say
with that.
personally, because I've already done it, I would have asked that 11th be considered.
So, I mean, we can add back in 5th and leave 11th, I mean,
Because I've done it in this case. so
Yeah,
I
the
would have
the
in
challenge
discussion.
when you then parse out 2 of the 4 grade levels at a high school, you do reduce the intent of the redistricting to create relief. Because now you're talking about basically half the kids you were considering are no longer going to move. And so it's just something to be mindful of. It does, it changes the number of kids and then reduces the impact of the redistricting overall.
I just, the only reason I'm
Yeah.
relatively certain I would have asked that 11th be included in that is because from personal experience. So I'm just
Yeah.
speaking from perspective of someone who personally went through it. So I would advocate for that option, but I'm only one, I'm speaking on behalf of myself.
It is still part, like, if space is available, so in consideration, there's a lot of like, yes.
Well, what you could
can
do
you
is.
say more though about the 11th grade?
Well, I just, having experienced it myself, when your student does complete 9th and 10th grade at a particular high school, you have built up quite a connection to that school, and then to be redistricted. Just, again, this is personal experience for myself, that I was grateful that when I went through the Oakdale-Urbana redistricting, in this case, Oakdale only opened with 9th and 10th graders, so my 11th grader did not have to
Sure,
leave.
sure.
And just looking back on that, it would have been very difficult. And I speak from perspective of an individual parent who foresaw that possibility and thinking about, both academically, I know we don't athletically, that my son, in this case, had built up a, quite a, just quite a connection with the school that he had already spent 2 years at. So that's why I propose that to some extent, and again, I speak as an individual board member, I propose at that level that the 11th grade be included in the possible waiver
What
situation.
you may want to think about is, because that rationale of the 2 years in a school and then to change could be difficult, could arguably be applied to elementary and middle too. So you're going to start hearing from 7th, you're going to hear from 3rd and 4th grade parents who are going to say, my kid's been from K all the way through 2nd. One thing you might consider is prioritizing 5th, 8th, and 12th. We call those transitional years. And saying, and as space needs are available, considering 11th. Sort of 11th is an extra, 5th, 8th, and 12th are all transitional years. They have all the same things in common because you're sort of get to spend that last year before you move on together. And that as it is available, you could add 11th. Sort of will pull 11th out a little bit. I don't know if that you feel like
I
that's.
just, again, speaking from
Yeah.
personal experience,
Yeah, for
I
sure.
would have had no trouble transferring my child. My child did,
Yeah.
because I went through 5 redistricting.
Wow, yeah.
So my child did move in the 7th grade into a new middle
Eighth grade,
school.
yeah.
So, and then I had my second child move in the 8th
Yeah.
grade. So I mean, I've experienced kind of all of it, where I had the option to keep my daughter, in this case,
Mhm.
at her previous 8th grade. We chose to go ahead and let her go to the new 8th grade. But my son left his middle school, that he went to
Mhm.
6th grade, and then went to 7th and 8th grade at a new one. So I feel like when we talk about this topic, I have a lot of personal experience about what I went through, both good and bad. And I personally disagree that the junior high and elementary, you need to go back 2 grades. There's just something about the connection with your high school.
Mhm.
There's, particularly as you grow emotionally and you're 16, you're driving yourself to school, there's a different connection, I believe, built within a high school environment than middle school and elementary school. Speaking again, personally, that just means more to me.
Mhm.
And the feedback that we're receiving during this process is a lot of people are talking about the connection they build with their community, 8th and 9th grade, but I really feel strongly about someone who's gone to 9th and 10th grade at a high school and then asking them to spend the last 2 years, particularly when you look at a situation where we're moving 140 kids out of they're one of only 140 kids of their high school that are now being asked to go to a new high school. So I'm getting off topic here.
So
So I feel strongly about 11th grade at least being left in the language. Whether we change the language, that we put some guardrails on that or not, it's up to the full board. But I feel strongly about 11th being included, and I agree with Mr. Bass that 5th should be left.
what is the consensus of the committee? That do we keep 11th in? Do we keep 11th in as like a tier 2, or do we take 11th out?
My preference is the language that Dr. Sergo suggested. Yeah, that's my personal preference.
So you'd be prioritizing 5th, 8th, and 12th equally, and then 11.
If-
if space allows.
And this is all based on if space allows.
They're all
Like,
right.
and it's all based on if space allows, but the 11th would be if space really allows.
And sorry, don't want to belabor the point. I just want to make sure I'm clear. The intent, though, is not that it would have to be 5th, 8th, and 12th. If the board was so inclined when the decision is made,
Right.
we could say 12th only because we're worried about
Right,
5th and
it's-
8th.
right.
I just want to make sure that
The idea is you won't consider 11th until the decisions on 5th, 8th, and 12th are made, because they're the ones that are going to get prioritized over 11th grade.
I'm outvoted, so.
But 11th stays in still.
But
Versus
we're
the other grade
We're
level.
deprioritizing it.
It's
Why
not
was
going
it
to,
added for the first time?
it was added for
Freshly.
the first time. That's a blue, the blue kind of blends in. That was an addition. That was not in the previous edition.
It's
or the
not
current.
currently in the.
It's not
policy.
currently in there.
Oh, gotcha.
Yeah, it's being added into the policy.
Then I advocate that we leave it.
I think we're just putting it after 12, but it's still in there.
Celeste, do you have thoughts on it?
I do actually. I was gonna jump in and then we moved. I think the high school experience, there's a couple of different things that I'm thinking of. First of all, a high school student. I have a 10th grader, so and my background's more in higher ed and high school. So I think there's 2 different things you're looking at. Traditions, of course, in your community, which we all have very rich and strong ones in all of our 10 high school communities. So the kids are looking in the first couple of years, like I'm getting into the, whatever my sport or my club, and then I've got my plan. And so we've got kids that are like, okay, well, my junior year, I get to do this in this class. And my senior, like they're kind of looking towards every year I get to progress in this academic field. And, I've got kids in woodshop that love what they're doing. And they've got, their plans are already made, but they're only in 10th grade. If they move, that's going to disrupt that. So that future planning for those 2 years is critical, but also they're starting to look beyond the next 2 years and where are we going after that? And they're building that resume to send off to colleges, to send off to military, to send off to wherever they're going to go. And I really do feel strongly that moving the 11th graders would really disrupt that. And then they would have to kind of start over and it would be a setback for a lot of those kids. Also, a lot of our kids are still struggling to catch up. They've all missed a couple of years of traditional education and, wherever that hit them, they're still experiencing a little bit of a different experience than most of us did that did not have the 2 years of disruption. So I do feel very strongly about keeping the 11th grade in to the priority of letting them stay. And I guess I had another question too, when we talk about if space allows, we do have a lot of cozy classrooms. And so I'm not clear on what that would mean to allow, for example, these 140 kids that we're maybe discussing now. So I just was curious about that as well.
So typically, as we look at a redistricting study, it's not just the next year or the year after. And so as staff interprets that we're looking holistically at what the long-term attendance boundary adjustment will do from capacity. And as an example, if we had a school that already had 3 portables, but we've adjusted attendance boundaries and we wouldn't need additional portables to support those students staying. If when asked by the board, our answer would be, we believe that space would be available given the existing capacities in the school, including the portable classrooms, that for two more years, it would create an undue burden above what already exists. So that's from staff's perspective, that's how if space available is responded to when asked by the board.
Question I have is how much would, if we include 11th grade and have 4 grades that are considered, how much would it hinder redistricting efforts?
So it depends. It would really depend on the redistricting study that we're in the middle one. When we open high school 11, hopefully it's sooner rather than later. But what we know, we have a need for an 11th high school at some point in the near future. I would say that would probably be a greater impact on our existing schools, because in order for us to justify the next high school, we have to have significant capacity challenges at multiple high schools. Right. And so that, without having data to say in this instance, that's just a good example of when that might be more problematic. If it's a large scale and there are a number of high schools already.
I just want to make one point. This language doesn't preclude us from doing anything, because it says consideration will be given to granting exemptions to redistricting decisions to students entering 5th, 8th, 11th, 12th. It doesn't guarantee them.
Yeah.
If we just leave the language as is, it's still saying we're going to give consideration to it, but based on space,
leaving the
we may unfortunately deny that.
Leaving the 4 grades listed on equal footing as in there does leave the flexibility for each unique redistricting process to prioritize the particular grades that need to be prioritized in that process. So there is some merit to just 5th, 8th, 11th, and 12th, and not scheduling them as one is a higher priority or a lower priority, and just leaving that to the unique circumstances of the redistricting you're undertaking.
You made me think of something. First of all, I really appreciate your point about the 11th graders I'm just thinking like from a blueprint CCR perspective. And I mean, that's really, I think, something that's, it's something really to consider. And I appreciate you raising that. But you made me think of something, 2 things. So if we are, Dr. Lipa, if we are in this way, this isn't that a parent of a 5th, 8th, 11th, or 12th grader would apply for an exemption. In the modeling, we would literally be saying, everybody but 5th is going, right? So that's where I wonder,
Gotcha.
Are we going to hear from a one-off rising 11th grade parent who wants their one kid? Doesn't this have to happen as a bundle?
It doesn't. Historically, when it has been approved, it has been, and the board will give parents the opportunity, if they wish their student to stay at their current attendance boundary, that they would be allowed to do so with parent transportation.
So the challenge I think about with that is around enrollment and staffing from a staffing perspective, because let's say there are.
We had them elect we gave them a deadline, or we've given them a deadline in the past that says by X date, you need to give your intention if you're going to stay. So we address those
So,
staffing
but if there's,
issues.
I'm making this up, if there's 100 kids in a fifth grade, in a school in fifth grade, and I'm making this, 80 of them decide they're all gonna go to the new building, and you've got 20 left behind, that's not enough to make a class and have one teacher by themselves teaching fifth grade. So isn't it more than space availability? Isn't it sort of space, and it's sort of this idea, we have to also maximize staffing, because if one fifth grader decides they will, also inverse, if only 10 kids, if there are 10 kids who don't ask for an exemption, you can't also start a new school with 10 fifth graders, right? Like, I don't know, what's the history been here?
So that exact type of scenario has not occurred or it's
Okay.
impacted. I guess my thought would be, it would be no different than if we had an odd grade configuration where we had 70 students in any grade. We would do that either through contingency staffing to overstaff, or we would look at multi-grade staffing, to do a fourth, fifth combo or something like that. So
Okay, so we can allow for one-off, we're not just making a decision that this redistricting model will not include fifth grade.
the only time it's been done in entire grade band, to Mr. Rose's point, is when we've opened up like a new school where we said we're only going to open it with
It's not
X
available.
grades. It's
Right.
not available.
And then I guess I wonder, to that extent, from this idea of staffing efficiency, you talked about cozy classrooms, I'm sort of also thinking the inverse. 7 kids with 1 teacher, is that fiscally responsible either? I don't know, I'm just wondering about that. It's a question.
I will propose that we leave this language
Okay.
as proposed, with fifth grade not being struck.
Add it back in. Yep.
That's what I'm gonna propose.
Yeah, I think compelling arguments are made on 11th grade. I think compelling arguments are also made on staffing. I don't want to belabor the point, but would it be wise for the end of the sentence to say if space and staffing is available?
And I won't belabor the point, but one reason I like this in here too, well, I'll belabor it. Because I feel strongly about it, so, but the reason I like this in is this is our policy.
Absolutely.
So the policy isn't saying do this, but it puts a focus onto staff that this is important. to us.
Absolutely,
That's all.
that makes sense.
And then there were not many changes in the next 2 sections. In particular, I wanted to highlight on page 5, we struck the entire section on disposition of real property. It has really nothing to do with this policy. We have a separate policy related to that, so I didn't see a need for redundancy.
Oh, I'm sorry. I did have a question. We're talking about the process. Is this process, how we're stating the language now, is that instead of providing multiple options, this would be a working document? Is that the way that we would make a proposal to the community?
Yep.
Similar to what we did this time. And then it says you would redevelop that proposal to then present to us.
And so,
Not necessarily multiple, it would be a working
would be
document then instead of multiple.
but it could result in like this time where multiple options made more sense.
Uh-huh.
But I actually use your exact language of, as a discussion starting point
Yes.
for that option. But in H, that's where, again, because not all if I can use Waverly as an example,
Gotcha.
There
No,
was
I'm
very-
sorry, that's a great point. H then gives us the power to say, okay, let's look at multiple options. Okay.
or in the Waverly instance, there was a small adjustment that we heard when we followed the same process for using court said, can we make this minor adjustment and come back? And that's what we did. And that's what it was ultimately voted on. So I didn't want to tie the board's hands with, we have to do X, Y, or Z.
Yep.
So you can be more responsive to the community.
Perfect. Thank you.
So if there are no other questions about this policy, the takeaway items are, we are going to add a definition of special program. Do we want to add a definition of child care center? We didn't talk about this, but Dr. Sergo mentioned childcare centers and they being kind of constructed in different ways. Some are in-home, some are actual facilities. But do we want a definition to make it consistent with other policies that talk about childcare, namely the appeal for if you seek to be an out-of-district school assignment? I can do a definition that aligns those two to make sure that they are consistent, if that's something you would like us to do.
And I'm just asking this question, maybe Dr. Servo, do we need to say licensed daycare provider? Or, I mean, if they just drop their kid
No, I
off
mean,
at a
I-
neighbor's
I'd have
house
to
for an
look.
hour.
I have to look specifically at our out-of-district transfer language, so I was trying to look up here.
I don't think it's specific to license as an example. You can use family
I think it
members.
just says childcare, so that's why I was
Okay.
suggesting we just change
Yeah,
it to
okay.
childcare, because we want to be aligned with the conditions that make you eligible for consideration for an out-of-district. I was just trying to look it up, but I think it's,
Because I think it made me think of an equity issue, you know, you think about parents on their way to work, drop their kid off in another district where they get daycare of a family member for
Yep.
free.
right.
So,
Yeah, no, it doesn't have to be licensed. I think it's,
Okay.
it's the notion of, my child, their before and after care is under with another adult in a variety of scenarios that are called childcare.
So-
So I would say yes, let's put a definition that aligns with what Dr. Sergo is referencing.
So we've,
See whether it is separate or sufficient.
so we have the
Make it consistent with other policies.
we have the two definitions, and then we're going to keep 5th grade, add 11th, or add back 5th grade, keep 11th grade, and add and staffing to that sentence. Those are all of the changes. So if the committee is comfortable with those changes, we can move this to the board for a first reading. One thing I do want to mention, typically board policies are implemented immediately upon board approval. I don't know that we need to write this into this particular policy, but I would recommend when it goes to the board that the motion to approve the policy is for implementation after the completion of the current redistricting study. Because what we definitely do not want to do is change the rules of the game as we are approaching the end of the current process.
agreed.
I just want to make one note that we have our regulation, it's a regulation, it's not a board policy, but regulation 400-15 is about out-of-district transfers, and it uses the term daycare, which I think this reg is going to be revised as well, but you know,
That's
even another term, it doesn't say childcare.
all part of trying to create that consistency
Right,
across the
exactly.
various
Right.
policies and regulations.
Well, maybe in our related regulations of this policy, we reference the regulations.
Okay, you said it's 400
15.
15, yeah. It says, it's actually in the framework of talking about redistricted schools. And that it's only with regards to K-8. And it says if a student goes to school from or returns after school to a home, should probably say broaden that, other than the student's own, because no parent can be at home, the name and address of the adult providing care must be recorded on their application for an out-of-district. The daycare provider must reside or be located in the requested district.
The only other thing I would add about this particular policy, if you do look at the related information, this is, I think, the first time I've broken it down by subcategories as opposed to just having a list. That came out of the policy committee or the policy workshop we did last week.
Okay. Yep, thank you.
And so, thank you.
Yes.
Yes, thank
So
you all very much.
Appreciate it.
Right, so next up is policy 319. I'm going to try and move us a little more quickly. There's a number of items, but there's a number of items, but we're the big ones were the first two that we had on the
Thank
agenda.
you for setting it up.
AMT is back. This was last revised in March of this year, and originally we had thought this was only going to require technical amendment to apply the new template because it had been so recently revised. But in looking at it as we were doing that, we came to realize, one, it was inconsistent with what we were doing in policy 300, that there were things addressed in 300 that were not addressed here. And so we wanted to make sure that we were in alignment and that everything was consistently being addressed. And then that there were some other, revisions that our human resources team thought were appropriate. So I will turn this over to Dr. Sergo and to Ms. Julie Nguyen, who is our HR director, to talk you through those changes.
So obviously we put it in the new template version that you can see. We added our policy statement to basically establish the terms of employment for our AMT employee group. As a result, we also removed the definition that was there in section B. And then the policy statements basically detailed the expectations of employees as far as the act of professionalism and then supporting their professional development. So we get down into item D, the implementation. It basically establishes the character of the AMT unit, the position group, and directs the superintendent to maintain a list of those positions that meet the criteria for this type of group that would obviously is unrepresented from all of our other employee groups. Into D2. We get into the conditions of the employment year to detail those out. That was not previously included. And those also are non-tenured positions. We do designate that. We get into D3, the salary piece, and this is to be more consistent and match the language that we brought forth in policy 300, since it kind of relies back to this policy. We get into item D4, the benefits. It replaces the extensive tuition reimbursement language with a more simple statement. And as you can see, that is why number of D5 is all crossed out, removing that, because those are similar benefits that are provided to our FACASA members. We mirror those benefits for this employee group. We get into D6, the evaluation of our AMT members, and we just kind of clarified that, but the language did not really change. They are still evaluated annually. We get into the personnel records, again, to provide more clarity and match policy 300. And then the discipline and dismissal piece, basically to match policy 300. And also will make the code of conduct and the progressive discipline language of 300 applicable to this employee group as well.
I have one question under policy statement. I think the first policy statement is very general. All AMT employees should have a clear understanding of what is expected during the term of employment, and I think we should be more specific there.
Okay. As far as the clarity you're seeking, what would you like to see from that?
Well, if the employee has one understanding and the superintendent has a different understanding, then that's not a clear understanding. So I guess who is determining expectations? How are,
Based on
Well,
like
the
job
Yeah, I was
notion
gonna
of
say,
the
don't they all
this
receive
statement
a
is
job description?
the purpose of this policy, the statement, this is what those this is sort of an understanding of that. I don't actually think this line is necessary. I think, I think we could actually do without it. But
to
if,
delete it?
yeah,
I mean, I think deleting it is one solution, or a good solution. It's
I don't
just so
understand
vague.
I don't understand what the purpose of it is.
yeah,
Because the next one says the board expects all employees to engage in their work in a professional manner. That sounds more like a board policy statement.
Well, if you refer up to the policy purpose,
Right.
it basically outlines that this policy establishes a common understanding of the terms and conditions of employment, which is basically saying the same thing as number 1, right? In
Right.
different
So we can strike C1.
we can work on that policy statement section and make it a little bit clearer of what the whole.
Might be
No,
good if you just
I think
struck
striking it.
C1.
Okay.
Did you have something else, Mr. Jones?
No,
Anybody else?
that's good catch.
Okay, this is.
All right, so this is, I'll mark this as ready to move to the board for first reading. Thank you both.
Thank you.
For all that discussion on the tuition reimbursement that we had previously.
So up next is 1.07, Policy 501, Curriculum Distribution. There are no attachments. There's no documents to look at for this one. We had initially discussed this on July 26th, and the intention was to bring back a draft to this meeting. However, in working through that draft, our curriculum and instruction team came to the conclusion that it may make more sense to collapse Policy 500, which is curriculum and course of study, with Policy 501. So merge them together and create a new Policy 501 to address library and media center services. And so rather than have the team put forth all that work to create, to do the collapsing and create a new policy, we wanted to bring it back for information and discussion a second time and have Mr. Murphy here. You're not doctor yet, are you? Okay. I keep wanting to elevate everyone to doctor. Have Mr. Murphy kind of talk through a little bit more about the rationale behind how we came to that decision.
Thank you. Good morning. So if you recall the last time we were here with the policy committee, we spent a lot of time really on the topic of reconsideration and wanted to think ahead of should that need to happen in the future, what we want to look like. And so as a result, this concept of a standalone policy around library materials and a look at the regulation on reconsideration would be important. Also, at the last board meeting, you approved having family life materials come to the full board for approval. So some of the things that we're thinking about doing in Policy 500 would be to very clearly delineate what is coming to the board for approval and what is delegated to the superintendent. And if you agree with this sort of general approach, then we'll come back next time with some policy language drafted. But what that would establish in the policy is that the essential curriculum framework and standards, new courses, pilot courses, textbooks, and now family life materials would come to the full board for approval. What would be delegated to the superintendent, which is currently in regulation, would be the additional resources that we create for teachers that are developed in summer curriculum writing, things like videos, those additional resources that we develop in-house would be part of what is delineated as delegated to the superintendent, with regulations that go with that. So last time we also talked about what is a standard operating procedure currently around all of those extra resources, the videos, the manuals, and also currently includes library. What that would do is take all of that stuff that's in a standard operating procedure and codify it in regulation. A regulation regarding all the instructional materials that I referenced, and then a separate one that is specific to library, all of which mentions the policy around reconsideration and a regulation that governs the entire the reconsideration process. This also gives us an opportunity to align the policy to 117 and some language that will be added to policy 500 to align with that. It will also give us an opportunity to create a specific regulation around digital tools and not having that sort of mixed in with the instructional materials, but a standalone regulation about the approval of digital tools, the accessibility requirements, the privacy requirements, and again, codifying that in regulation. So that's our thinking right now, the best way to tackle this. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. And then, like I said, if you support this approach, we'll come back next time with language drafting.
Would digital tools also include some regulations around AI use?
We've been talking- We think that's in the grading policy, but we have been talking about it.
Okay. I'm not sure, it has come up, I think.
Yeah.
Well, it's come up in schools.
Yeah, for
classrooms,
sure.
Also as part of.
I think it's a good opportunity for us to address that there. It's currently also mentioned in the code of conduct. And so there's different places that we're starting to see it, but I think that's good feedback.
As long as it's covered. So, Mr. Blivis, can you go back and say what you started by saying we would be looking at collapsing
So-
two policies into a new 501? So it was 500, and was there another policy?
No, so we would be collapsing the current 501 into 500, which is curriculum and course of study. And then because 501 would then be decommissioned and would be a gap in the numerical system, we would replace it with a new 501, which would be the library and media center related.
Creating two standalone policies.
Yes.
Correct. So 501 currently references those instructional materials that I talked about. That could be folded into 500 very easily. And then 501 could stand alone as a policy on approval of library materials.
Okay.
Mhm.
I like that.
I definitely appreciate and would agree with that approach that you outlined.
That makes sense. What would be the timeline in coming back to policy committees?
So our next session is the 20th. I mean, I will defer to you as to whether it's realistic that we would have something ready by the 13th, which is when we would have to upload it to board docs. Or whether it needs to go on the December 13th session.
I think if there's room in the agenda, I think we could bring it back to the next meeting.
There's room in the agenda.
And just to sort of look, I think this is a great plan, and I think, so 501 is one of those policies as it's written now that I don't think is a full policy. It's about 2 paragraphs long, and it hasn't been looked at in 16 years. So it's only on curriculum distribution. So to pull that out and put it in 500 makes total sense, and I love the idea of front-facing this. And I know one of the things Mr. Murphy and I talked a lot about is the actual process of looking at materials and evaluating them was not a regulation. It was a standard operating procedure. And one of the things Mr. Blivis has really helped us to tease apart is what is the difference between a standard operating procedure and a regulation? And, you know, the idea of the standard operating procedure, if I'm quoting you correctly,
Go for it.
is something that governs the work of an office or a group of people around how they conduct themselves. A regulation is when it has sort of systemic impact. So we think it needs to come out of being a standard operating procedure in the curriculum unit and really be a regulation that really makes transparent for everyone in the school system how these reviews are conducted, what are the processes that are in place. So we're creating a new regulation to go with these revisions.
I really appreciate
Important that.
and the approach, because I do think that it allows for more transparency.
Absolutely.
People know where to go to reference, and there's not necessarily the about
Mhm.
is this a policy, is this a
Right.
practice that
Yep.
we try to do.
Right.
So, and I would love to see this on our agenda in November for us to consider and obviously feedback.
And we'll keep in mind, you know, that this will be a robust discussion. So the agenda may end up being a relatively short looking agenda, but it's going to take the full 2 hours most likely. Thank you.
Since it's really just a matter of folding one and opening up one, you don't feel it's necessary for us to provide any input today on language or, I just don't want you to have to do a lot of work and then
We had,
more work.
I hadn't uploaded 500 and 501 with that in mind, but certainly if you have some feedback you want to give to Mr. Murphy, now would, you know, that would
Let
certainly
me
be welcome.
clarify, I think, what I think we can do by the next meeting, which is bring in a full draft of 500. I don't think we would have 501 built out by that time,
Okay.
but we could, you know, provide some high level sort of areas of organization, areas that it will hit, as well as thinking about what the policy would contain. But I don't think we would be able to have that all drafted in the next couple of weeks.
Okay.
So not a new 501.
Correct.
So do 500 on the 20th and maybe 501 at a later.
Yeah.
And so much of curriculum is governed by COMAR. It's actually not, as Dr. Dyson always says, there's not a lot of local control
Right.
in that regard in terms of frameworks, right? There's some local control in other places. So I think that that makes a lot of sense to proceed that way.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so we've completed the direct review of policy portion of the program. And now we're going to talk the next couple of items are more kind of broad policy committee approach type items. The first is item 1.08, which is the 400 series review roadmap. Now, when we met previously, the instructions I was given was to try and group together the policy 400 series policies, starting with the oldest and then bringing them together in groups based on their subject matter. So like policies are collected together. And so what you see in front of you is a draft of those groupings. The colors have no particular meaning other than it's just helpful to make it easier to see which groups are aligned. And they are within the groups, they are not in any particular order, other than I tried to capture them together. So suspension and expulsion, which is the first one on the list, is our oldest policy. March 2206 is the last time it was updated. That does not mean it was the last time it was reviewed. It just means the last time we made a change to it was March of 06. That kind of couples in my minds and the minds of those I consulted with student rights and responsibilities and student discipline. So that's why those three are the first three together. And then you'll see removal of students from school area, which is also March 22 of 06. And we can attack any of the group one items in whatever order the policy committee wants to approach them. But these are the groupings that I was able to come up with. Not every group has the same number of policies because, again, it's kind of tried to capture it by subject matter. And it may mean that some groups will take 3 or 4 policy committees to complete. Some might only take 1, but I think that that's good because, as you have seen over the last 6 months, we've not been just dealing with 300 series. We've been interspersing other policies that need their attention, and some take more time than others. And so we need to have an approach that recognizes that there may be meetings that we only have 1 new policy in front of us because we're still dealing with another policy. So this is what I've got for you, and based on this, we can start selecting what we want or what you want at the November 20th meeting.
Well, I also think, if we happen to have a light agenda from, like, when we're carrying over to lunch, we could also group 2 of the smaller.
Sure.
5 and 6.
Sure.
There's only a 4
Right.
collectively together, and so.
Yeah. And there's nothing that says, if we're done 4 of group 1, we can't do the last of group 2 of group 1 and the first one of group 2, right? The idea though is just I want to try and minimize the burden on our staff as well. So I can tell you that the same individuals are responsible for suspension and expulsion, student rights and responsibilities, and student discipline. So I'm only going to have them come 1 time. That was part of the thinking in putting this together.
Helpful.
I like that.
I think to be clear, this is going to take us,
Oh, this is 2 years.
okay.
This is
I knew
I just
that.
wanna
When I
be-
looked at this, I was like.
Okay, yeah, but I do think that's really helpful in terms of helping the public see the magnitude of what the work looks like and understanding. We can certainly go around this process, but this is our intent.
Yeah, I think that's something that I'm glad you pointed out, that people need to realize when COMAR changes, law changes.
But we gotta pop something
We have
in.
to pop something in, which,
Mhm.
so it's a long process.
Yeah.
I support the layout. I think you followed board intention on reviewing oldest policies first and grouping together makes good sense. Am I right that we've been able to get through most of the 300 series in 1 year, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a little bit less. I mean, I think that we kind of rebooted and started over when I came into this position. So we really started 300 in April, and we've motored through, but it's been a burden on the staff. And as you know, it created a backlog of policies that weren't ready. You weren't able to go to the board until last Tuesday. And so just also being mindful of, we don't want, while I don't have a problem with bringing policies to the board at every board meeting, we don't want to spend the entirety of every board meeting looking at policies. There's other work you have to do.
Yeah, I guess it's just to say I'm not loving the almost the commitment that this will definitely take 2 full years. I'm hoping that we can review the 400 series in less than 24 months.
It is entirely possible. So, I looked at this at a very high 30,000 foot level, noting the sheer number of policies that we are looking at. I did not dive deep into any one of them to be able to say, well, this one is going to require an extensive amount of discussion, and this one is going to be a very quick one. It may be that as our subject matter experts are going through them, a lot of them don't require a great deal of revision. It may be that a lot of them are driven by COMAR, and COMAR just hasn't changed. And so we may be able to get through them, more quickly. The flexibility of having 2 years protects us from trying to race to a shorter deadline, but certainly if we can get it done in less, we're going to work to keep the train rolling.
I am trying to remember, we've had some discussion and maybe not finalizing that we want to review all our board policies. At one point, I think we said within 3 years.
Well, we updated.
Yeah, I think it's within 5 or 6 now.
No,
6 years, yeah.
It previously was 3 years. We revised it when we have revised policy 114 to 6 years, with the intention being every series gets 1 year and 400 gets 2 years because of the sheer volume.
This is our largest bundle of policies.
Yeah.
But also, to your point, Mr. Bass, why we didn't put dates here, because we could go
Could be
fast.
18
Yeah,
months.
right. It can go faster or slower. Yeah.
And I would also say the change to 114 makes the first reading is more important than it had been in the past, because you only get the first reading, and the second reading is we're going to vote to approve. So I think when you think about it, if we tried to ramrod 6 policies on first reading in front of, I think that would be inappropriate. So it's important that we take a look at it that way, that yes, we streamline 114 in order to maybe move things along, but it makes that first reading even more important to the full board, that they have an opportunity to give the type of feedback necessary that we can complete policy, from their input at the next meeting. So
Well, and I think that's
I think it's
why. the
important to recognize
forms that Mr. Blivis developed too, the analysis form and the summary form, also make it a little bit easier for board members to go in and say, okay, this is why this has changed, this is where it's changed, and having all of those along with the red line policy, to me, is helpful for the full board who haven't been part of this discussion, as long as they've reviewed those in advance, that it's very clear this has been processed, the discussion, the analysis, this is all the factors we considered. So I think along with 114, as well as the process improvements that you've made, should hopefully help us.
Well, and
But also-
only, what is it, like 5, most of these have had some attention in the last 10 years.
Right.
Which is a different circumstance than we found ourselves in with 300. So
Right.
I also see less heavy lifting in the revisions, because with the exception of the ones that have 06, it looks like most of them have dates since 2015 or sooner. So that would suggest they're going to be mostly technical, just formats and things like that.
I think I just want to say it's all good, to me, all good points around. I think that, I think we've been moving at a good pace. And I think some of the, a special work session to review and approve policies was wise, and I think could be done by future boards, 2 or 3 times or more. So it's all to say, I just don't want us to lose our momentum.
No, and that's really not the intention. And the one other thing that I want to point out on here is, as I was going through, I tried to capture if there is a specific policy statement or a requirement in the law as to how often it needs to be reviewed. So the dress code for students, in the policy as it's written, it says it's going to be reviewed every 2 years. That obviously then falls outside of the 6-year cycle. That's going to have to come up every 2 years. Graduation is an annual review. Educational equity and excellence is a minimum review of every 3 years per COMAR. I tried to just kind of note that it doesn't change anything. It's just there for reference.
It's my last point, not to belabor it, but then actually with that educational equity and excellence, I think we are overdue.
We did it actually this past spring. There were no changes that needed to
These
be
dates
made.
refer to only if there are substantive changes, not
Correct.
last date of review. I
Correct.
have- No, okay,
That is confusing though. We may want
Yeah.
to.
yeah.
Right. They're all going to get updated because they're all going in the new template.
So
So
the-
they'll
Yeah,
all
on
have
those
the
on those
2020
ones where it
3 or
says
24.
Minimum review, I think it would be good to have the date that last review.
Yes.
I will add that for those 3 lines. The challenge in putting minimum reviewed is the existing policies don't always say the date on which they were last reviewed. Some of them only indicate the year. There's always a date on which it was updated though. And so that's why I went with update, because I can't say with any certainty what month or day,
Which board meeting?
or necessarily even whether it was captured that it was reviewed in that particular year. I just don't want to state something as fact when I don't think. Well, that's what we're doing here, right? So, but I can certainly for those 3 lines, I can make an amendment to this to clarify that.
Thank you.
Yeah, we did in the spring.
I know we reviewed it, but I thought we made some updates to it as well.
It would have been before Mr. Blivis began, I believe. Did we do? before-
No. Because I
We
reckon
did it?
I recognize that it was
It might have
looking
been
at
that
Comar.
first in April.
It might have been the very first one.
Yeah.
I do remember us reviewing it.
Mhm.
But we don't have.
My recollection, if I'm thinking of the right one, Ms. Gallagher, is that there was some language added to include the importance of developing that would trigger the regulatory reviews. I'll have to go back and check.
It was reviewed at the May 17th meeting. There were only minor edits. Dr. Harris was here. The action was to bring back with revision, and I don't know if it ever came back. It came back on the June 28th, which was the meeting that I was not here for, so I don't have any notes. So I don't know what the action was coming out of the June 28th.
We did, we'll look.
We'll look back.
We have noticed.
Okay.
Yeah, because there were some.
The
It's
notes
like
are
we
real.
haven't updated the review date
Mhm.
on the current policy.
But there are some significant that's on the June.
I think it would be in board docs.
Meeting, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm
It
looking
should be,
at it
yeah.
from our,
You got it.
I'm looking at it from our policy meeting, so, but that might need to, maybe just come back here for a final review in the middle of the whole work. Or
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has not gone to the board.
I don't
So,
know,
We'll have to maybe look.
and that would be why the last update remains what it is, because it hasn't gone to the board. It may have been approved by the policy committee on June 28th to move forward, but it hasn't been brought to the board yet. That would make sense.
So that probably needs to get on our list for first reading, I'm guessing,
Mhm.
because I don't think that we had significant. edits
Yeah.
on The 28th,
Mhm.
but that probably
We'll go,
does-
we'll go look at the 28th and see if we missed anything else.
The next item on the agenda, which Ms. Gallagher, you referred to as the policy analysis. And I really only bring this forward to you to share that we're making some further revisions to the policy analysis form. This is based on feedback we've gotten, and this is a new thing, so it's a bit of a work in progress. And since we did share it with the board previously, I wanted to at least share it with the policy committee. If you look at the version of the form that is dated 10/17/23, you'll see some red boxes. Those are the items that have changed. We've marked that you only need to select one for the policy committee recommendation. I was getting a lot that were checking multiple items. To capture the discussion we had with Ms. Yoho at the meeting on the 17th, I've changed it from non-technical amendment to substantive with non-technical in parentheses to help clarify which is which. And then the big change is in number 5. And this was the question about asking what are the other LEAs doing? And, part of the questions that came to me in private conversation were, well, do we really have to look at all 24 LEAs and certify that all 24 do or don't, or which ones do or don't? Because that is an incredible amount of work. And so to try and ease some of that burden, I've reframed the question as, if you're looking at other LEAs, check the boxes. And if you didn't, just mark none. And that's it. And that's all that we need to know, because I think the intention there was really just for the board to know that, yeah, we're not standing alone as the only LEA looking at this as a policy. And then if questions want to be asked about, well, what do other LEAs do? Or, why didn't you look at any other LEAs? That question can come up during the discussion. And then the last change is just in the signature section, trying to condense it so it would fit better. So what I will do now that we have a few policies to move forward, I will use the new version, the October 17 version, and I will send these to you so I can get your signatures with the checking the approved box to upload to board docs when we present this to the board. And then the last item, and we will get done before the 11:30 cutoff. We're working on some changes to the policy and regulation website, both to the app that we use to house the policies and regulations, where you can go in and you can sort just by policy or just by regulation. You can search for a key term, and it will identify all the policies and regulations that recognize that term. For the most part, we're working on updating that to add a new field that will indicate when it was last updated. So that will be sortable as well. So you'll be able to go into that and say, I want to see the most recent things the board or the superintendent has done with respect to regulations. Click, and it will sort by date. Because one of the things you cannot do right now by looking at that application is know what's changed. There's no way to know. Like, you won't know whether we've changed policy 101 unless you go into policy 101. And that seemed, it seemed like we could make that a little bit easier by adding that field. And it seems like that's a process that is relatively easy to do. The other thing we're going to do is, when you go to that policy, by hovering over it, it should create a bubble that pops up that captures the summary of changes, very much like the table that I've been attaching to the policies that present to the policy committee and then to the board. So not only will you be able to see that a change has been made, but you'll get a summary of what those changes were without even having to open up the policy itself and see the actual changed language. In the interim, what we are going to do is that document that I attached, we're going to make that document available as a link on the policy and regulations website. And that's actually not, I presented it to you as a PDF. It actually is going to be a living Google Doc that me and my team can access. Anybody else can look at, but not edit it. So we don't have to keep uploading new ones every time. When we make further changes, we can just add them to it, and it'll create a long running list. That is part of our effort to be more transparent about the work that we're doing here.
These are outstanding changes. The date of last updated could be slightly confusing. Like, if I look at regulation updates, last updated on October 9th, is that referring to that there was a superintendent regulation committee meeting on October 9th, or that the Google Doc was updated on October 9th?
Can you clarify?
Well, it says uploaded on the regulation dates, but on the policy updates, it says date updated.
And I can clarify that as well.
Yeah, so date uploaded, I assumed that was the date it was uploaded.
Well, sometimes there's distance between the RRC meetings and not unlike policy committee meetings, right? Sometimes it's just, the meetings are held, but it may be a couple of days or maybe longer before we get it in final form to be uploaded. So I was thinking the last RRC that we had was on October 5th. So it's not related
I'll
to
admit I'm
RRC.
behind on the dates, on getting some of the regulations finalized, and uploaded into the system. But I can add a column and do the date it was approved and then the date it actually made its way into
Yeah,
the
that
new,
makes sense.
into the application.
Yeah, I think date approved is probably the most relevant, but, yes, if someone is checking on a regular basis, it's also helpful to see, oh, and this Google Doc, this was just updated, 3 days ago or 6 days ago.
Yeah,
Right, because the batch that we did on October, it hasn't made it on.
not all of them.
Okay.
Some of them,
Some of them, yeah.
but not
Well,
all.
and I also appreciate that there will be a link available to the Google Doc too, because of course there's sometimes when you lag
Yeah.
when things come through and get approved and actually get updated. So I think it's just one more step in terms of our communication and consistency with our community. And so I appreciate that that will be shared and our board as well can have a point of reference.
Agreed.
Because we often, in terms of the regulation update, if we have a question about when regulations have been updated or haven't, that's be helpful to have that in the process.
I very much agree.
Thank you.
Yep, great work.
So that is what I wanted to share about how we're trying to update our website and improve it.
That takes us to
111, adjournment.
which is adjournment. Pretty good. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.